Okay, let's unpack this. You've probably seen the headlines, these massive fortunes held by the ultra-wealthy, yet their tax bills sometimes seem, well, surprisingly low.
Right.
What's the story there? Today on the Deep Dive, we're diving into a really key part of that picture, limited liability company, LLCs.
Mm-hmm.
And the crucial insight here, I think, isn't just tax reduction, but often it's effective tax avoidance through these legal structures. They seem straightforward, but they can get incredibly sophisticated.
Yeah, and what's fascinating really is the kind of dual nature of the LLC. For lots of people, it's just a simple way to structure a small business, protect your personal assets.
It's your house, your savings.
Exactly. But for the very wealthy, the scale, the complexity of how they use LLCs, it transforms these things into really powerful tools, not just for shielding assets, but for navigating the tax system in ways that honestly are often just not accessible to most people.
Right. So understanding that transformation, that's kind of our mission today.
That's the goal.
Because, while LLCs have a totally clear and legitimate purpose for entrepreneurs, for managing risk, we're focusing on how they're used at the absolute highest levels of wealth.
And that's where it becomes this sort of intricate world, raising some serious questions about, financial fairness and transparency.
Definitely. So let's start right at the beginning. What is an LLC, fundamentally?
Okay, so at its core, an LLC, a limited liability company, it's a business structure. And what it does is create a legal separation between the owners and the business itself.
A legal wall, almost.
Pretty much. The separation means that the personal assets of the owners, their house, car, personal bank accounts, are generally protected if the business gets into debt or faces legal trouble.
So it's a shield between your personal finances and your business dealings.
Exactly. That's the fundamental idea.
Right. And the original concept, the intention, was really to encourage people to start businesses, wasn't it? To innovate, take risks, without potentially losing everything they own if things went south.
Yeah, it definitely fostered that entrepreneurial spirit. Take a shot without betting the farm, so to speak.
But here's where it starts getting really interesting for our deep dive. When we're talking about individuals with, vast wealth, the stakes are just different. And how they use LLCs goes way beyond that initial idea of simple liability protection.
Way beyond. And a huge part of this advanced usage involves taxes, how the LLC is treated for tax purposes, what makes them so flexible and potentially so advantageous, especially for the wealthy.
Well, it really seems to come down to choice, doesn't it? Unlike some other business structures, an LLC doesn't have just one fixed tax designation. The owners can actually elect how it's taxed. They can choose to have it treated like a sole proprietorship or a partnership or even like a full-blown corporation.
And that ability to choose, that election, that opens up some significant avenues for, let's call it, tax optimization.
Yeah, optimization.
Precisely. And for many high net worth individuals, that pass-through taxation option, that's often particularly appealing.
Explain pass-through.
So pass-through means the profits generated by the LLC aren't taxed at the company level, like a traditional C Corp. Instead, the profits just pass through directly to the owners.
Okay.
And then they're taxed on their personal income tax returns at their individual rates. Now, you might think, well, their rates are high, and they often are.
Right, top brackets.
But this structure, when you combine it with strategic deductions, sophisticated tax planning, maybe some loopholes, it can often mean a lower overall tax burden compared to if the income was taxed at the corporate level first and then again when distributed.
Triple taxation avoidance.
Essentially, yes. Plus other benefits. And get this, it gets even more interesting with something called depreciation.
Depreciation. I always found this one a bit counterintuitive with appreciating assets.
It can seem that way. So depreciation, in accounting, it's a concept allowing businesses to deduct the cost of an asset over its supposed useful life.
Yeah.
Reflecting wear and tear.
Like a piece of machinery wearing out.
Exactly. The idea is to match the expense of using the asset with the income it helps generate over time. But here's the twist.
Okay.
Even on assets that are actually increasing in value, think prime real estate, a commercial building owned through an LLC, the owners can often still claim depreciation as a tax write-off.
So wait, the building's market value is going up, maybe it's generating rental income. But for tax purposes, you can claim it's losing value each year.
That's often how it can work, yes. The building's value on the books for tax appreciation goes down, creating a paper loss that can offset other income, even while its real-world value climbs.
Wow, okay.
It's, a mechanism technically designed for the real-world decline of assets, but applying it to appreciating assets within LLCs really shows how the tax code can be, well, strategically used in ways that seem counterintuitive and definitely benefit those with big holdings.
Okay, so we're seeing the tax angles, flexibility, pass-through, depreciation games. But let's shift gears a bit. Let's delve into another area where LLCs get really fascinating. How they can be used to make ownership. Well, kind of murky. Less than obvious.
Yes. This brings us squarely to the concept of asset concealment, or maybe obscuring ownership is a better term. While liability protection is a clear benefit, the structure of LLCs allows for a pretty significant degree of opacity, hiding who really owns what.
How does that work in practice? Think about it, right?
Yeah.
If you own a property directly, your name's usually on the title deed. Public record. But if that same property, say a fancy luxury condo, is owned by an LLC, the public record might just show the name of the LLC, like 123 Main Street Holdings, LLC.
That's the first layer, just the LLC name.
But it can go much, much deeper than that, can it? What if that LLC is owned by another LLC?
Exactly. And that one by another one, maybe registered in a different state or even a different country.
So this is the layering strategy you hear about.
Precisely. It's called layering. Imagine person A wants to own a valuable asset anonymously. They set up Company X LLC.
Okay.
But Company X isn't owned directly by person A on paper. It's owned by Company Y LLC, which might be registered in, say, Delaware or Wyoming, states known for more privacy.
Got it.
And Company Y, in turn, might be owned by, I don't know, a trust or another LLC, maybe based offshore. Each layer adds another degree of separation.
Making it harder and harder to connect person A back to that original asset.
Increasingly difficult. By creating this chain of entities, often deliberately spread across different locations with varying disclosure rules, figuring out who the ultimate beneficial owner is the person actually benefiting becomes incredibly challenging.
So we could be talking about like a $20 million Manhattan penthouse. And on paper, it's owned by Penthouse Lux LLC,
Right.
which is owned by Global Real Estate Ventures LLC, registered in Delaware.
Which might be owned by Overseas Holdings Ltd. In the Cayman Islands, perhaps.
It's like following a thread through a maze just to find out who really holds the keys. And this isn't just real estate, right? It could be yachts, art, private jets.
Absolutely. It can apply to a whole range of valuable assets. And it's important to say this tactic isn't only used by billionaires, though they certainly use it. Politicians, other entities, they might use similar structures for various reasons, privacy or liability being key.
Okay. Which leads us nicely into real estate specifically.
Yeah.
Why is property such a common asset to find tucked away inside these LLC structures? What makes it so attractive?
Well, there are several really compelling reasons. First, as we kind of touched on, real estate, especially in prime locations, tends to hold its value or often increase over time. It's seen as a stable store of wealth.
Safer than stocks sometimes, maybe.
Potentially, yeah. Less volatile, perhaps.
Yeah.
Second, it can generate consistent income, right? Rental income flowing into the LLC.
Okay, makes sense. Stable value, income stream.
But crucially, you combine the tangible nature of real estate with the potential for obscured ownership through LLCs. And it becomes a really attractive package for those seeking both security and anonymity.
So it's a way to hold significant wealth in something solid, something real, but also potentially untraceable, or at least very difficult to trace.
That's a big part of the appeal for some, yes.
And for a long time, certain states, Delaware comes up a lot, Wyoming, Nevada too, they were known for having very minimal requirements about disclosing who actually owned the LLCs registered there, right?
That's correct. For many years, these states, while offering other legitimate business advantages like established corporate law or low fees, also made it relatively easy to form an LLC without publicly naming the beneficial owners.
So you could set one up, essentially anonymously?
Pretty much. The lack of readily available ownership information made it tougher for creditors, sometimes tax authorities, even in legal proceedings, to easily figure out who was really controlling the assets held inside those LLCs.
And things changed much there.
Well, there's definitely been a growing push, internationally and domestically, for greater transparency. New laws like the Corporate Transparency Act in the U.S. are starting to require more disclosure of beneficial ownership to the authorities, though not necessarily public disclosure yet.
So progress maybe, but it's slow.
It's evolving, but you have to remember, a huge amount of wealth is already held in these established, often anonymous structures, and navigating or unwinding that is complex.
Right. So, okay, it's not just about keeping things private from, say, the tax man or the public eye. LLCs also offer that layer of protection against other risks, like lawsuits.
Oh, absolutely. That's a core function, going back to the original purpose, but amplified. If someone gets sued personally and their valuable assets are held directly in their own name, well, those assets are potentially on the line in a judgment.
Exposed.
Exposed, exactly. However, if those same assets, the properties, the investments, the art collection are held within one or more LLCs, they become significantly harder for creditors or plaintiffs to reach.
Why is that? Because of the legal separation.
Precisely. That legal shield we talked about. A lawsuit against the individual owner generally doesn't automatically pierce through to the assets owned by the LLC. They are separate legal entities.
Can you give us a kind of concrete example?
Sure. Imagine a wealthy individual gets into, say, a bad car accident and faces a massive lawsuit, far exceeding their insurance. If they personally own 5 valuable properties, stocks, bonds, etc., all that could potentially be seized to satisfy a judgment.
Okay.
But if each of those properties is owned by a separate LLC and the stocks and bonds are held by another investment LLC, the person suing them faces a much tougher battle.
They can't just grab the LLC's assets because they sued the owner personally.
Not directly, no. They might have to try and go after the owner's membership interest in the LLC, which is a different, often more complicated legal process. Or they might try to pierce the corporate veil, arguing the LLC is just an alter ego, but that's a high legal bar to clear, especially if things are set up properly.
So it makes recovery much harder, more expensive, maybe even impossible sometimes.
It definitely complicates things significantly for the person trying to collect. And this protection isn't just for accidents. Think about divorce proceedings, too.
Ah, yes. How does it play out there?
Well, if marital assets are tangled up in complex LLC structures, maybe layered across different entities, it can potentially obscure the true extent or value of the marital estate,
Making it harder to divide assets fairly.
It can certainly complicate the process of identifying and valuing everything that should be on the table for division, again, adding layers of complexity.
And we touched on this briefly, but the really extreme cases, LLCs owning other LLCs, spanning multiple countries, that must create just a formidable barrier to anyone trying to figure out ownership or make a claim.
Oh, absolutely. It can create a truly significant obstacle. When you establish a chain of ownership that crosses international borders, you're dealing with different legal systems, different languages, different levels of transparency and cooperation between authorities.
A legal nightmare to untangle.
For someone trying to trace ownership or enforce a judgment,
Yes.
it becomes incredibly challenging, time-consuming, expensive, and in some cases, maybe practically impossible to penetrate all those layers down to the ultimate beneficial owner. It's a substantial deterrent.
So, okay, we've covered a lot. Tax angles, hiding assets, lawsuit protection, divorce, the complexity.
Right.
To kind of bring it all together now, what's the core message here? What should listeners really grasp from this deep dive into LLCs and the world of the ultra-wealthy?
I think the fundamental takeaway is this. LLCs, while often presented and used as these straightforward business tools for liability protection, well, their application by the very wealthy really goes far beyond that basic function.
They evolve.
They absolutely evolve. They become these highly sophisticated instruments. Tools for achieving significant tax advantages, yes, but also, crucially, for creating these complex layers of ownership that can effectively shield assets, shield them from public view, from legal challenges, maybe even from tax authorities to some extent.
And it really does prompt a huge question, doesn't it? Looking at the whole picture, should this level of financial opacity, these kinds of advantages, really be available primarily to those at the very top? You know, when we think about the tax obligations and the financial realities that most people face, does this system feel like a level playing field? Or does it actually contribute to widening those gaps, the inequalities we already see?
That's the critical question, I think. It forces us to think about fairness, about transparency within our whole economic structure. What are the broader societal implications when these sophisticated financial tools seem to disproportionately benefit a very select few?
Yeah.
It's definitely something to ponder, long after this discussion ends. What kind of system do these structures help create?